One of the most iconic and well-known landmarks from our past, this 2000 years old giant amphitheater is a clear testimony still to this day of the engineering skills of the ancient Romans. Just to give an idea of its monumental stature, it has been estimated that rebuilding the Colosseum today, even employing modern techniques, would cost more than 300 million euros. So, without this hefty sum at hand, the only thing we can try is to attempt instead a CG reconstruction. With the fair warning though that returning its greatness in full is today nearly impossible without making any arbitrary assumption. In fact, though we know quite a bit about its overall skeletal structure, so to speak, there's instead a severe scarcity of sources when it comes to interiors, decorations and the likes. Now, before we start, let me give you just a bit of context. When Vespasianus from the gens Flavia became emperor, he decided that he wanted to bolster his fame among the people. Hence, he torn down the Domus Aurea, built by Emperor Nero on land dispossessed after the Great Fire, and started in that very same place the construction of a grand amphitheater. 10 years later, in 80 AD, the Flavian Amphiteater would be finally complete. The nearby presence of the colossal statue of Nero is supposedly the source behind the name Colosseum. With a total height of about 50 meters, subdivided into 4 levels each represented by a specific classical order, the structure would top a modern 50 stories building. In its many functions ranging from hunts to gladiators' fights to naumachie and executions, the amphitheater could host approximately 50,000 people that would take seat in the cavea based on their social status. The Colosseum could be filled or emptied entirely in roughly 15 minutes thanks to an ingenious system of passages and pathways called vomitoria, while a massive velarium or awning placed at the very top would shelter spectators from sun or rain. For this project, I went step by step, focusing on a single floor at a time and every time starting from the outer shell and then progressively building my way toward the center. Now, when we think about the Colosseum, we can't help but think about arches and archways. In fact, there are as many as 80 entrances into the building, the 4 main gates plus 76 more supposed to be used by common people. In that sense, it was pretty natural to start the whole process by building the fundamental element of the entire structure, indeed the arch. To help with that, I leveraged on both a frontal and a side orthographic references coming from the same source, which is ideal, but in general, speaking of references, it is actually important to try to compare as many different sources as possible as to establish a sort of a common ground. For instance, for this project, I used as the main source of information a very comprehensive study conducted by Julien Godet. But along with that, I gathered as well a few additional resources, such as real photos on site, reconstructions, drawings of sections of the structure, floor plans, and so on. Generally speaking, before even starting a project like this, I would spend quite some time studying and researching and ultimately organizing all of the useful visuals into a specific Pinterest board for future reference. Back to the arch with the main shapes in place, I would start modeling the profile at the top, switching again between this useful reference containing all the main profiles present across the structure and my main side orthographic reference. Lastly, I would cut the main arch in half, reposition it at the center and use a mirror modifier as to have a symmetric final shape with the 2 half archways at the sides, and you'll see why in a minute. When approaching reconstructions of any sort, I would usually advise to start working from the beginning in a real-world scale. As such, I would define at first the perimeter of the building like you would on a real construction site, based on the fact that we know the Colosseum to be 156 meters by 188 meters and elliptical in shape, thing which would definitely cause some headaches later on, as we will see. The general idea in laying out the ground floor, but really the whole structure of the Colosseum, is this. Differently than a circle-shaped building where, especially when symmetrical, we could just model a small enough slice and then copy it over and over until we fill the whole perimeter, in facing elliptical shapes we need to account when modeling for a way less comfortable method of subdivision. In fact, since the slope of the curvature is different at the focal points than at the center, the minimum common denominator becomes actually an entire quadrant. And this is reinforced by simply looking at the floor plan of the amphitheater, where we see the internal structures being organized almost 100% symmetrically among the 4 different portions of the building. As such, we could focus on just one of the quadrants and then simply mirror the rest. This intuition, surprisingly or not, would be coherent with the hypothesis put forward in 1923 by the Italian engineer Giuseppe Cozzo that the construction of the Colosseum was for real organized in 4 different work zones, one for each quadrant, with 4 construction crews working simultaneously. This hypothesis, driven by the observation of some little inconsistencies among the different quadrants in the placement of the travertine corbels of the third level of the structure, will later be dismissed by archaeologist Armin von Gerkan that would rather ascribe such differences to a later reconstruction stage of the building. In any case, apart from what actually happened, this would just marginally impact the CG reconstruction, as focusing on just a single quadrant would still be the most viable and logic option. Given that, I would hence take my main arch and add an array modifier with 20 or 80 divided by 4 iterations on the x-axis. I would then convert the elliptical perimeter into a curve and add a curve modifier right after the array modifier, targeting the elliptical outline itself. I would then move the arches on the x-axis until their placement is in line with the minor axis of the ellipse, and scale up to align them with the major axis as well. To fill the whole perimeter, I would then simply use a mirror modifier on both the x and y axis, targeting a cube placed at the dead center of the scene. This method has a couple of nice perks. The first is that we only need to take care of a single quadrant, as mentioned, while the second is that we can still work on a straight line when modeling, which would make moving vertices around much easier, since each transformation would be aligned to the general orientation of the 3D world. As a final validation to this method, I would then measure the height of the arch after making it fit into the elliptical perimeter, and this would correctly show a height of just above 7 meters as in its real counterpart. After modeling the crepidoma, which is this couple of steps at the base, I would then focus on the Doric column to be placed in between each archway of the ground floor. The most effective way to create the entire series of columns is by using instances and geometry nodes. For that, I would duplicate the elliptical outline and create a new geometry node system, converting the curve to points with a total count of 80 points and adding an instance on points node to the chain. I would then bring my column model in and connect it to the node tree. For the columns to be aligned the right way, I would store the tangent vector to the curve as an attribute and use it as an input in the align Euler to vector node. Lastly, I would use a transform geometry node to perfect the final placement of the columns. With that done, I would proceed by aligning a reference drawing of the section of the Colosseum to the arches model in its straight pose. In this way, whenever I need to add a new piece, like the second series of arches that along with the first one would constitute the ring corridor A of the ground floor, I would just have to move it on the y-axis and the composition would still remain readable with respect to the benchmark image and correct when putting the entire model in its final elliptical form. In this very same way, I proceeded to complete ring corridor B as well, creating for both A and B corridors what would be their annular vault, which is nothing else but a barrel vault shaped in some sort of circular pattern. Then I would continue my way toward the arena, assembling the different pieces using the same logic. As I progressed in pushing toward the center of the amphitheater, one thing became clear. As we are dealing with an elliptical shape, the more we come closer to the center, the more there would be some kind of distortion, especially in the areas nearby the focal points of the ellipse, causing in our case the arches to narrow down progressively as we move along the curve. Of course, this is not necessarily a general rule. In fact, to have a uniform distribution of the mesh along the curve, we could simply create an additional outline position right where the mesh is supposed to be, recenter our mesh and switch the curve target to the new outline. In this way, the mesh wouldn't have any kind of visible distortion around the poles of the ellipse. However, in modeling the Colosseum we have some specific requirements. In particular, we need to lay it out as a concentric ellipse where archways form linear passageways toward the arena. Hence, we cannot employ a solution as the one just shown, and we do need instead to embrace a bit of distortion. But is this something the actual Colosseum engineers and workers had to deal with? In a paper named The Amphitheater Construction Problem, Paul Rosin and Emanuele Trucco asked themselves a similar question. Given the many difficulties that an elliptical shape entails, may be the case that amphitheaters were built instead as piecewise circular approximations to ellipses? Their study seems to point out, though, that a true ellipse would fit the data represented by a set of acquired planimetric points of the Colosseum better than any other approximated shape. Hence, what about the real thing? By looking at both the floor plan and at some of the photos on site, we can clearly spot that shapes are actually narrowing down for real as we move closer to the poles. Thus, some distortion seems to be fine and after all inevitable, and as such I knew I could safely move on with the modeling process. With these considerations out of the way, I would complete the modeling of the ring corridor C along with its annular vault. You can notice that the latter is moved a bit upward with respect to both corridors A and B, and that's presumably to accommodate for a draining system, which is reinforcing the idea that Naumachiae were truly possible. It would be now time to include as well the staircases leading from corridor C and B of the ground floor to corridor B1 of the Ionic story. In particular, these staircases would be arranged in this fashion. A first group of 5 with the central staircase going straight from C to B1 and vice versa, and 2 pairs of staircases that would have a turn halfway in between the 2 stories leading from B to B1. Then other 3 groups of 3, each with 1 straight staircase and 1 pairs with a halfway turn. Truth is, I would have gone crazy if it wasn't for this procedural staircase system that I built with geometry nodes, and which, in case you wonder, you can find described in my other video covering the reconstruction of the temple of Castor and Pollux located in the Roman Forum. In any case, I'm currently planning to release in some form these along with some other utilities and stuff that I use often in my projects, so if you're interested, make sure to give me a follow on Instagram to receive further updates. With that out of the way, I would go on and model as well the staircases leading from Ring Corridor C through the Vomitorium and to the first set of seats, the one closer to the arena called Podium, made of 4 big marble steps where senators and high officials would have their individual reserved spots. After I modeled the entrances too and the back wall, I proceeded to create the steps themselves using that same staircase generator. Once turned everything into a proper quarter ellipse, it would be clear that in order to make the entrances and the distance among the different sets of steps uniform, as this would be the case in the actual arena, conversely than what we saw with the archways, this time we would need to voluntarily apply some distortion to the model in its straight pose, arbitrarily enlarging those shapes that would sit closer to the focal points of the ellipse, so that when the curvature is finally applied, everything will look as uniform as it is supposed to be. Once Corridor D, the arena with its various entry points and the additional accesses to the podium were modeled as well, the entire ground floor would look something like this. Time to move up to the second floor, where the arch of the outer shell would be slightly shorter than the one at the ground level, and where, additionally, there would be a sort of a basement to accommodate for the placement of statues. This level is conceived around the Ionic corridor. If you want to have some insights on how to model a Ionic column, you might want to take a look at this other video here. For the placement of the columns, I simply reused what I already did for the ground floor. Once modeled the ring corridor A1, also in this case characterized by an annular vault, I would continue by modeling the floor, making sure to leave the necessary gaps for the staircases going to and coming from the corridor C and B of the ground floor. Concerning ring corridor B1, one peculiarity here is that this would be split into a bottom and a top part, where from the bottom part it was possible to gain access directly to ring corridor C1. This story would be as well characterized by pairs of staircases, one from ring corridor B1 leading to the vomitoria accessing the set of seats called Menianum Secundum, reserved for common citizens, and one access from ring corridor C1, and that would instead lead to the top section of ring corridor B1. From ring corridor C1, moreover, it was also possible to gain access directly to the Menianum Primum, which was the part of the cavea reserved to the Roman noble elites. The other peculiarity of ring corridor B1 is that the bottom corridor, differently than what we had seen up to this point, was characterized by the presence of groin vaults. Also in this case, I have a couple of videos on how to model different types of vaults within Blender that you can check in case you are interested. In general, wherever you see an X on the Colosseum floor plan, that is indeed to indicate the presence of groin vaults. I then proceeded to model the Menianum Secundum along with its vomitoria as well as the top part of ring corridor B1 with its set of stairs that would lead up to ring corridor A2 of the Corinthian story. Moving up one more level, I simply repurposed what I did for the Ionic story as to model the archway laying on the outer shell of the Corinthian floor, also in this case taking care of the gaps corresponding to the staircases coming from corridor B1 top. I then would start working on the main wall that from ring corridor B2 would give access directly to the Menianum Secundum. For the columns of this story, I reused my Corinthian model, and also for this I have a couple of videos showing the process I went through to create it. I would then employ once again the geonode system already in place for both the Doric and Ionic columns of the outer shell of the amphitheater. This was the progress at this stage, pretty advanced but still, of course, incomplete. It was then time to build the growing vault system also for this story, as well as all of the different staircases, with one type leading to the vomitoria of the Menianum Secundum Summum, which is this top part of the cavea reserved for non-Roman citizens and slaves, and the other type leading instead to Ring Corridor A3. I could at this point start refining and taking care of some smaller details, just like the system of columns and pediments decorating the main wall at the front of Ring Corridor B2. The final step in completing the main structure would be to model the top floor, which would again feature Corinthian columns, just this time with square shafts. One of the features of the top floor is the presence of little basements that would serve as a support for the wooden mass sustaining the Velarium. Along with that, a nice combination of profiles would decorate the top extremity. This top level was designed ideally to host wooden seats reserved for the lowest strata of the Roman social structure and would feature an internal ring of Corinthian columns running along the elliptical perimeter. Lastly, a series of bronze decorative shields would be placed on the outer wall. Just like many modern stadiums, the Colosseum was designed to make spectators as comfortable as possible. In that sense, a massive awning called Velarium would be put to use as to shelter the cavea from sun or rain. We do not know actually how it would work precisely, but it is believed that experienced sailors from the Misenum fleet were employed to maintain and operate it, extending and retracting the awning with incredible dexterity. The Velarium would consist in several separate pieces of fabric maneuvered by a complex web of ropes and supported by the 230 wooden masts evenly spaced along the perimeter of the outer shell of the top floor. Whenever we are working with cloth simulation in Blender, we need to account for a few things: a proper subdivision of the main mesh, pins and hooks. In fact, we would generally need a bit of geometry to work with in order for the simulation to be smooth and precise. Along with that, we do need as well to identify the vertices that would be standing still once the simulation runs, assigning them to a specific vertex group and targeting this group from within the shape subpalette of the physics tab. To create folding patterns, we can then use hooks, which are nothing else but moving pins. The easier way to do that is to select the pins we want to move and hit Ctrl-H and hook to new objects. This will automatically create an empty targeted by the hook modifier. We then need to move this modifier before the cloth one, hit the spacebar, and once the animation is running, just move the empties around to their desired position. This is nice and all, but in the end I chose to go an easier way. Right after giving each sail its main shape with a simple cloth simulation, I would select the portion that I wanted to appear as retracted, delete it and place at its extremity a mesh prepared in advance, simulating a folded piece of fabric to give the illusion of the specific sail being rolled outward or inward. With the main model finally complete, it was now time to work a bit on textures. Let's address right away the elephant in the room here. It is very likely for the Colosseum, like any other Roman building, to be vibrant in colors and decorations all over the columns, walls, arches, vaults, and so on. To this day, we do not have robust enough sources that would allow us to replicate such beauty in a non-arbitrary way. For this reason, my final decision when texturing was to limit the process to just represent the main materials that would have been used. In particular, I knew I needed some variations, especially with regards to travertine, to account for the brick-style pattern on the outer walls, as well as the layer pattern we can observe for columns and a plain variation for profiles in general. To create the first two variations, I moved to Substance Designer, where I would lay out some very basic tiled patterns to be then exported and used in Blender as normal maps, ambient occlusion maps, and color variation maps. Moreover, one peculiar aspect of the archways on the outer shell is the visible protrusion of shapes running along the different arch profiles. To simulate that, I would leverage on the existing geometry with just a combination of insets and extrusions to create the main pattern. I then exported this as my high poly mesh and the unmodified version of the archway as the low poly, on which I would simply apply the normal map resulting from the high to low baking process performed in Substance Painter. For this to work, generally you need to have a clean UV map of the low poly mesh, of course, and you also need to ensure that the details you wish to be appearing on the normal map are not exactly perpendicular to the surface, otherwise non-normal information could be anyway retrieved. For that, and this is how I did it in this specific case, a simple bit of a bevel could be more than enough. With that out of the way, I imported a base travertine material into the scene, hooking it up to the mesh, and I started creating and assigning the different materials to each specific portion based on what I could tell from a main reference. I would then move on and create a sort of plaster brick material for the interior part of the structure by combining a scanned brick material with a mixed color node centered around white light greyish tones, employing grunge maps to achieve a bit of a color variation. Since the plaster is supposed to be layered on top of the bricks, for the normal map it is enough to mix the original normal texture with a bump node fed by a white RGB node, where the mix factor again can be represented by a grunge map. With this simple set of materials, plus a couple more for the arena, the wooden parts of the top floor and the bronze shields, I would consider the texturing stage completed and I would be ready to move on and start working on some finishing touches. The first one was to add statues to both the Ionic and Corinthian stories. Now 80 archways and 2 floors would mean a total of 160 statues to create, which would have been basically an impossible task to achieve in a reasonable amount of time. As such, using as a source the pack of famous classical statues from Dada Design, I just picked a few, trying to stay as much as possible on the safe side and avoiding those either widely known or instantly recognizable, and I assigned them to a unique collection. For their placement, I repurposed also this time the geonode system already employed for the several rings of columns, using as an input the statues collection and using the pick instance option along with the separate and reset children options on the collection itself, and a random integer value for the instance's index as to randomly spawn the different single statues along the perimeter of the ellipse. And I did this of course for both the stories, resizing the statues to a reasonable size and applying to them the travertine material used throughout the scene to better integrate them with the rest of the composition. But what is an amphitheater without a crowd? Hence, with the main model ready, I knew I wanted to take one step further and fill it with people. To do that, I used the Procedural crowd add-on from Blender Market, and I have to say the procedure was actually relatively simple. I would select the part of the cavea I wanted to work on, hide everything but just the seats, and then isolate for each seat just the face looking upward. I would then select one horizontal edge and then select similar direction, right-click and subdivide to just subdivide the seats vertically. I would finally poke all of the faces, select just one of the central vertices and then select similar amount of connecting edges, Ctrl-I to invert the selection and X and delete vertices. In this way I was left with just a bunch of vertices, each one at the center of each seat. And with the On Vertices option of the Procedural crowd add-on, I would add a single person on each vertex, selecting as the focus point the arena so that the crowd would actually look at the show. I would then manually delete some of the unwanted vertices to avoid compenetrations or illogical placements, and I would then repeat the same procedure for all of the parts of the cavea. Of course, the set of models included into the add-on is supposed to be used for scenes taking place in modern times, but from a distance this still works pretty decently. Additionally, there's the possibility of using custom models, which is something I may look into for future scenes. At the end of the process, with all the sections of the cavea completed, by looking at the statistics, I would end up approximately with 52,000 people in total, which is in line with historical sources concerning the standard capacity of the Colosseum. After a few further refinements, this is what the whole model would look like. We can wrap this video up by taking a tour inside the Colosseum. Suppose we were not very lucky in life and that our seat was located in the Medianum Secundum Summum. I would put myself in front of one of the main gates, even though presumably being this low in the social system, we would have to access through one of the other 76 gateways. But anyway, did you know that in the viewport under View Navigation you can select Walk Navigation to simply walk the scene? That's pretty useful, especially when dealing with big architectural models such as this one. So I would go through Ring Corridor A and then Ring Corridor B as well, all the way toward Corridor C. From there I would take one of the staircases leading to Corridor B1 of the Ionic story and then find my way to C1, from where I could take the passageway leading to B1 top, where a little staircase would conduct me to Ring Corridor A2 of the Corinthian story. Finally, from Ring Corridor B2 I would reach the staircase to access the vomitorium that I would use to enter the cavea. Not minding people with hats and sunglasses in what is supposed to be ancient times, I would quietly look for my spot using the ramp, and this in the end would be my side of the arena. Well, after all, not that bad, to be honest.